Hi everyone, my name is Alicia Parrish and I'm doing my presentation over the poem Miscegenation written by Natasha Trethewey. Some of the things I'm going to be talking about is the background of the poet. I'm going to be reading the poem, kind of talking about what the theme is and one of the characters, like who he is, um, literary elements, conclusion, and then a final reading. Some background on Natasha. I got this picture of her because it was my favorite, and I think she looks really pretty in it. She was born April 26, 1966 in Gulfport, Mississippi. She had an African American mother and a Caucasian father. They're both in an interracial marriage, which was illegal in Mississippi at the time when she was born in the 60s. Um, her mother was a social worker and her father was a Canadian poet and teacher. Her father actually encouraged her to get into poetry since he was a poet himself. So that kind of reflects on some of the writings that she does now. Um, Her parents divorced. Later after that, her mother got remarried and the man was abusive to her. Later, the abuser murdered her mother. This helped Natasha attempt writing at poetry at the age of 19. And you can kind of see how it impacted her as a child in some of her writings, since almost all of her writings are in remembrance of her mother and talk about her father as well in her childhood. Now I'm going to be reading the poem. This was written in 2007. I forgot to put that somewhere in here. Okay. So miscegenation. In 1965, my parents broke two laws in Mississippi. They went to Ohio to marry, returned to Mississippi. They crossed the river into Cincinnati, a city whose name begins with a sound like sin, the sound of wrong, in Mississippi. A year later, they moved to Canada, followed a route the same as slaves, the train slicing the white glaze of winter, leaving Mississippi. Faulkner's Joe Christmas was born in winter, like Jesus, given his name for the day he was left at the orphanage, his race unknown in Mississippi. My father was reading War and Peace when he gave me my name. I was born near Easter, 1966 in Mississippi. When I turned 33, my father said, "It's your Jesus year. You're the same age he was when he died." It was spring, the hills green in Mississippi. I know more than Joe Christmas did. Natasha is a Russian name, though I'm not. It means Christmas child, even in Mississippi. So as you can kind of see, Mississippi is used a lot throughout the poem. So where she was born obviously had a huge impact on this poem, I would kind of say, or that's kind of what I'm getting from it, because we saw that she's born in Mississippi and she kind of has a lot of negative feeling and meanings towards Mississippi. One of the reasons why I chose to write or do this project over Natasha is because when we first read her poem in class, White Lies, I was really intrigued by her story and I really was interested in her type of writing because I've never like read poetry like hers before. And I was just really interested in it. So when we were assigned this project, I definitely really wanted to use it as my example. Both of my parents are in an interracial relationship. My mom is African American and my dad is Cuban and Irish. So I kind of experienced some of the things she did growing up because I went to an all-white school. I was one of like three Black kids in class. So a lot of her poems, when I read them, it kind of reminds me of some of the things that I went through. So yeah. So part of the theme I've kind of noticed is involving the Joe Christmas character. It kind of reflects on how she's writing in a way because there's a lot of comparing, but I'll get onto that later. But let's focus on who Joe Christmas is. When I first read the poem, I didn't know who he was, so I had to go back and research it and kind of educate myself a little more so I could have a better understanding of the poem. Joe Christmas is a protagonist character in the story named Light in August, written by William Faulkner, who is also mentioned in the poem. He is a biracial young man growing up in the American South. He was abandoned by his grandfather, along with being made fun of by white kids, since he was darker than everyone else, even though he was light skinned. Kids didn't care, they still made fun of him, which was really sad. Um, so in the poem itself, it was quoted that Faulkner's Joe Christmas was born in winter. I highlighted Faulkner Joe Christmas because obviously that's who we're talking about. Um, this line to me, it kind of left me confused because the comparing of Jesus in the poem was just kind of confusing to me. So I don't really know any information on that. Um, but Natasha is starting to acknowledge and realize where she is from and coming to an acceptance that she is different than the others. I think that kind of ties in with it in a way because when she mentions, I know more than Joe Christmas did, I believe this is referring to that because in a way you can kind of tell that Joe Christmas didn't have a understanding of who he was and the color of his skin and why people made fun of him. And this is a weird poem. Some of the terms, there were two terms in here that I kind of noticed. So one of them is illusion. Back to the topic of Trethewey mentioning Joe Christmas, illusion is presented within that stanza. Um, illusion, as we learned, is an indirect or passing reference. So that's how I kind of applied it to that stanza. Sorry, I'm getting over a cold. So um, I believe illusion is shown in Faulkner's Joe Christmas was born in winter, like Jesus given his name for the day he was left at the orphanage, his race unknown in Mississippi. So yes, this is where I started to apply it to illusion because I started to realize that there was a passing reference. Um, like I mentioned in the previous slide, Joe Christmas is a biracial boy from the story Light August. You can see that there is a lot of comparing going on between the two, but I'll get into that in the next slide. So metaphor is comparing two things without using the word like or as. So, like I said, comparing the two of Natasha and Joe Christmas in the poem is kind of what I think Natasha was trying to get across was that she did not want to be compared to him because she had a better understanding of who she was. And you can kind of see that later on in life as well, as she's more confident with who she is and she's accepted who she is. The poem uses multiple examples of a metaphor because Natasha is often being compared, like I said, and they grew up being treated differently by white people, especially white kids in their schools. Um, one of the stanzas that I did notice was considered a metaphor, I think, was they crossed the river into Cincinnati, a city whose name begins with a sound like sin, the sound of wrong, miss in Mississippi. So sin in Cincinnati is where her parents did get married, like she said, and she's comparing it with the word sin because she knows what her parents did was considered a sin back then, since they were two different races getting married. A lot of people believed that your race should stay with your race and you shouldn't be in an interracial relationship at the end of the day. The sound of wrong in Mississippi. I noticed that Miss is also in the title of the poem, which is kind of, to me, I kind of think of it as a negative, derogatory kind of term. She didn't like Mississippi, I feel like, because of this reason. There was racism, just a lot of negative things throughout her childhood. So I think that's why it was compared or mentioned in the title as well. And that's kind of why she named the poem that for a reason. Another thing I noticed was repetition of the word Mississippi throughout the poem. She used it in almost every single sentence. Like I said, she wanted to get that point across that in Mississippi, only these things happened, or in Mississippi, in her world, this is what happened. And I think it was a very negative um, experience in her life, and that's why she wanted to write about it. I feel like she writes about almost all negative things that happened in her life. Like when talking about white lies, she talked about the lies that she had to tell to feel like she belonged in Mississippi. So I feel like that kind of applies to almost all of her poems in a way. Sorry. Right. So then I'm going to be reading the poem one more time since we did discuss all of the elements that I found throughout the poem. So I'm just going to read it one more time and then we are done. Miscegenation. In 1965, my parents broke two laws of Mississippi. They went to Ohio to marry, returned to Mississippi. They crossed the river into Cincinnati, a city whose name begins with a sound like sin, the sound of wrong, miss in Mississippi. A year later, they moved to Canada, followed a route the same as slaves. The train slicing the white glaze of winter, leaving Mississippi. Faulkner Joe's Christmas was born in winter, like Jesus, given his name for the day he was left at the orphanage, his race unknown in Mississippi. My father was reading War and Peace when he gave me my name. I was born near Easter, 1966, in Mississippi. When I turned 33, my father said, "It's your Jesus year. You're the same age he was when he died." It was spring, the hills green in Mississippi. I know more than Joe Christmas did. Natasha is a Russian name, though I'm not. It means Christmas child, even in Mississippi.